March 7, 1967, just outside Cu Chi, South Vietnam. Sergeant Michael Walsh and his German Shepherd, Rex, walked point for 3rd Platoon, 15 meters ahead of 40 men who trusted their lives to a dog's nose. The jungle ahead looked empty. It always did. That was the problem. Viet Cong guerrillas had spent months perfecting their ambush sites in this sector. Punji stakes hidden under leaves, tripwires tied to grenades, spider holes camouflaged so perfectly that American patrols walked past them dozens of times without noticing. Standard doctrine said, sweep the trail visually. Check for disturbed earth. Watch for bent vegetation. But Walsh wasn't watching the ground anymore. He was watching Rex. The dog stopped, ears forward, nostrils flaring. 60 meters ahead, far beyond where any human could see or smell danger, Rex had detected something the Viet Cong believed was undetectable. A carefully constructed ambush site. Freshly turned earth, the faint scent signature of human sweat, and recently handled metal that lingered in humid jungle air for hours. In tunnels beneath Cu Chi, Viet Cong commanders were about to learn that their greatest tactical advantage, the element of surprise, had just encountered an enemy they never planned for. American scout dogs could smell their traps before anyone died, and that changed everything. Subscribe for more untold war stories. The problem revealed itself in the most mundane way possible. Casualty reports that made no tactical sense. Between January and June of 1966, the 25th Infantry Division logged over 300 casualties from booby traps and ambushes in the Iron Triangle and Cu Chi regions, more than double the number from direct firefights. Men were dying to enemies they never saw, triggered by traps they never detected, in jungle so dense that visibility rarely exceeded 20 meters. Standard infantry doctrine taught soldiers to watch for tripwires, disturbed earth, and bent vegetation. But the Viet Cong had been refining their concealment techniques for 2 decades, first against the French, then against the South Vietnamese army. By the time American ground forces arrived in significant numbers, VC guerrillas could hide a punji pit or command detonated mine in ways that defeated visual inspection entirely. The training manuals assumed you could see the threat before it killed you. The jungle proved otherwise. Captain Robert Jackson arrived at Cu Chi Base Camp in February of 1966 with a simple observation that would eventually save thousands of lives. Human eyes were the wrong tool for the job. A former military veterinarian who had spent 3 years training sentry dogs in Germany, Jackson understood something most infantry officers did not. Dogs possessed between 220 million and 300 million scent receptors compared to a human's 5 million. They could detect human odor at concentrations humans could not, register, identify the chemical signature of freshly turned earth from 60 meters away, and sense the metallic tang of buried ordnance through layers of jungle debris. More importantly, they could do all of this while walking point, before the patrol entered the kill zone. Jackson's proposal was straightforward. Deploy scout dog teams ahead of infantry patrols to detect ambushes and booby traps before they could be triggered. Division Command approved a trial program with 8 handler dog pairs in March of 1966. The dogs, primarily German Shepherds and Labradors, selected for temperament and scent discrimination ability, had completed 12 weeks of specialized training at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas. Their handlers, all enlisted men who volunteered for the program, learned to read canine body language with the precision of radar operators interpreting scope returns. A change in ear position, a shift in gait. The angle of the dog's head as it processed scent information carried on humid jungle air. These micro-signals, invisible to untrained observers, provided early warning that could mean the difference between walking into an ambush and avoiding it entirely. Sergeant Michael Walsh and his German Shepherd, Rex, were among the first teams deployed. Walsh was 23 years old, a farm kid from Iowa who had grown up around working dogs and understood that trust was not given, but earned through consistency. Rex was 3 years old, 68 pounds of focused intensity, who had scored in the top 10% of his training class for scent discrimination and alerting behavior. Their first patrol together came on March 15, 1966, along Route 13 north of Ku Chai, a stretch of red dirt road flanked by dense jungle that had claimed 17 American lives in the previous month. Walsh walked 15 meters ahead of the platoon, Rex on a 6-foot leather leash, both of them moving at the deliberate pace that allowed the dog to process scent information without rushing past critical signatures. They covered maybe 300 meters in the first hour, slower than standard patrol speed, but speed was no longer the priority. Detection was. At 0930 hours, Rex stopped. Ears forward, nostrils flaring in rapid succession as he sampled the air. Walsh halted immediately, raising his left fist, the signal for the platoon to freeze. He watched Rex's body language. The dog was not looking at the trail ahead, but slightly to the right, toward a section of jungle that appeared identical to everything else. No disturbed earth, no bent vegetation, no visual indicators of any kind. But Rex's alert was unmistakable. Walsh called for the platoon's explosives expert, a specialist from Kentucky named Davis, who had disarmed more booby traps than anyone else in the battalion. Davis approached carefully, following Walsh's exact footsteps, and began probing the area Rex had indicated. 3 meters off the trail, buried under 4 inches of leaves and dirt, he found a pressure-detonated mine, a Soviet-made PMD-6 wooden box mine filled with 200 grams of TNT. The Viet Cong had placed it precisely where a soldier would step if he moved off the trail to avoid an obstacle. Standard infantry procedure would have missed it entirely. Visual inspection would have detected nothing. But Rex had smelled the explosive compound through the soil, the wood, and the organic debris, a scent signature his training had taught him to recognize and alert on. The platoon disarmed the mine, photographed it for intelligence purposes, and continued the patrol. Over the next 4 hours, Rex alerted 3 more times, 2 tripwires connected to hand grenades, 1 spider hole concealing a VC sniper who withdrew when he realized his position had been compromised. 0 casualties. The patrol returned to base that evening, having accomplished something that seemed impossible just weeks earlier. They had walked through known VC-controlled territory without losing a single man. Walsh filed his after-action report that night, noting the specific alerts, the distances at which Rex had detected threats, and the environmental conditions. Temperature 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity 92%. Wind calm. These details mattered because they established baselines for understanding how scent detection worked in operational conditions. Jackson collected these reports from all 8 handler teams, analyzing them for patterns. The data was overwhelming. In their first month of deployment, scout dog teams detected over 40 booby traps and ambush positions. Casualty rates in units operating with dog teams dropped by 63% compared to units without them. Word spread fast. Platoon leaders who had been skeptical about the program, men who thought dogs were a gimmick or a liability, began requesting handler teams for every patrol. The dogs were not infallible. They could be confused by heavy rain that washed away scent signatures, by wind that carried odors in unpredictable directions, by their own fatigue after hours of intense concentration. But their success rate was high enough that they fundamentally changed how patrols operated. Instead of reacting to ambushes, units could now avoid them. Instead of triggering booby traps and evacuating casualties, they could disarm the devices before anyone was hurt. The tactical advantage was significant, but the psychological impact was even greater. For the first time since arriving in Vietnam, American soldiers felt like they had a tool that worked in the jungle's favor rather than against it. They were no longer walking blind into an environment designed to kill them. They had Rex and Jody and the 7 other dogs whose noses could detect what human eyes could not. And that changed the calculation for everyone involved, both the soldiers who walked behind the dogs and the Viet Cong guerrillas who suddenly realized their ambushes were being detected long before they could be sprung. The Viet Cong adaptation came faster than anyone expected. By May of 1966, intelligence officers at Cu Chi began noticing changes in enemy behavior that suggested the Scout Dog program was having effects far beyond simple casualty reduction. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed that VC commanders in the Iron Triangle had issued specific directives about American dog teams. One document, recovered from a tunnel complex near Ben Suc, instructed guerrilla fighters to withdraw immediately if they spotted a dog on patrol rather than risk detection. Another, dated April 23, ordered unit leaders to prioritize targeting handlers and their dogs with sniper fire whenever possible. The bounty structure was explicit: $50 American for killing a handler, $75 for killing the dog. In an economy where the average VC soldier earned less than $5 per month, these were extraordinary sums. The enemy had identified the dogs as legitimate military threats and was responding accordingly. Lieutenant Nguyen Minh Tri commanded a Viet Cong company operating in the Ho Bo Woods east of Cu Chi. Dense jungle, interlaced with tunnel networks, his fighters had spent 3 years constructing and defending. Tri was 31 years old, a veteran of the war against the French, who had learned his tactical craft through survival rather than formal military education. His specialty was ambush design, selecting terrain that funneled American patrols into predetermined kill zones, positioning his fighters to maximize enfilade fire, and in placing booby traps along likely withdrawal routes. Between January and March of 1966, his company had inflicted 42 American casualties without losing a single fighter. The tactics worked because they exploited American predictability. Infantry patrols followed established routes, moved at consistent speeds, and relied on visual observation that rarely detected well-concealed positions. But in April, something changed. 3 separate ambushes failed because American patrols stopped and withdrew before entering the kill zone. No firefight, no casualties, just sudden awareness of danger where none should have been visible. Tri's after-action analysis identified the pattern. Every patrol that detected his ambushes had been led by a soldier walking with a dog. The realization forced a complete reassessment of VC tactical doctrine in the region. Ambushes that depended on concealment were no longer reliable. Booby traps that had worked for years were being detected and disarmed. The element of surprise, the fundamental advantage that allowed a numerically inferior guerrilla force to inflict disproportionate casualties, was being systematically eliminated by animals whose capabilities Tri had not anticipated. He understood immediately that this was not a temporary problem. The Americans had found a countermeasure that worked in the jungle environment, and it was spreading. Intelligence reports from other VC units confirmed the same pattern across 3 corps. Dog teams were being deployed with increasing frequency. Casualty rates against American patrols were dropping. The tactical advantage was shifting. Tri convened his platoon leaders in a tunnel complex 3 kilometers east of Cu Chi on May 7, 1966. The meeting lasted 4 hours. The central question was straightforward. How do you ambush an enemy that can smell your position before seeing it? Traditional concealment techniques, burying approach indicators, avoiding vegetation disturbance, minimizing human odor, were designed to defeat visual observation. But dogs processed information through scent, and scent was governed by different rules. Human odor molecules lingered in humid jungle air for hours. Freshly turned earth released chemical signatures detectable at ranges far beyond visual contact. Even the metal components of booby traps, wire, grenades, mine casings, emitted trace odors that trained dogs could identify. The VC had been optimizing their tactics against the wrong detection system. The countermeasures developed over the following weeks reflected both creativity and desperation. Some units attempted to mask human scent by moving through streams or applying camphor and other strong-smelling substances to their bodies and equipment. Results were mixed. Dogs could still detect the underlying human odor once the masking agent dispersed, and the camphor itself sometimes attracted attention, by being anomalous in a jungle environment. Other units tried increasing the distance between ambush positions and likely patrol routes, setting up kill zones at ranges of 60 to 80 meters instead of the usual 20 to 30. This reduced the probability of scent detection, but also reduced the effectiveness of small arms fire and made command detonation of mines more difficult. The most successful adaptation was also the simplest. Avoid contact entirely when dog teams were present. If a patrol was led by a handler and dog, VC fighters were instructed to withdraw silently rather than risk detection and the subsequent artillery or airstrikes that would inevitably follow. Survival took precedence over engagement, but withdrawal was not always possible, and the frustration among VC units was mounting. Fighters who had spent weeks preparing elaborate ambush sites were watching American patrols detect and avoid them without firing a shot. Morale began to suffer. In June of 1966, Tri's company attempted a new approach, targeting the dogs directly. Snipers were positioned along known patrol routes, with explicit orders to shoot the dog first, then the handler. The theory was sound: eliminate the detection capability, and the tactical advantage disappears. The execution proved more difficult. Dogs were smaller targets than humans, moved unpredictably, and were usually positioned at the front of patrols, where firing would immediately compromise the sniper's location. 3 attempts in as many weeks resulted in 1 dog wounded, Rex, who took a rifle round through his left shoulder on June 19th, but survived after emergency veterinary care at Cuchi, and 2 VC snipers killed by return fire before they could withdraw. The exchange rate was unfavorable. By July of 1966, the dog teams had fundamentally altered the tactical environment in the Cuchi region. Intelligence estimates suggested that booby trap and ambush effectiveness had declined by approximately 50% in areas where scout dogs operated regularly. More significantly, VC units were shifting their operations away from zones with high dog team presence, effectively ceding terrain they had controlled for years. The dogs were not invincible. They could be killed, wounded, or temporarily evaded through careful adaptation. But they represented a persistent problem that required constant resource allocation and tactical adjustment. For an enemy fighting a protracted guerrilla war with limited ammunition and manpower, this was exactly the kind of drain that could not be sustained indefinitely. Corporal William Henson and his Labrador, Jody, exemplified the program's expanding success. Henson was a quiet handler from Oregon who had worked with hunting dogs before the Army and understood that dog performance depended on handler consistency. He and Jody had detected 63 booby traps and 17 ambush positions by late summer of 1966. 0 casualties in any patrol they led. The numbers were specific, documented, and undeniable. Other units wanted what Henson's platoon had: the ability to move through hostile territory without constant fear of invisible death. By August, the 25th Infantry Division had expanded the program to 32 handler dog teams. Demand exceeded supply. Training pipelines at Lackland were producing new teams as fast as possible, but the dogs required months of preparation, and not every handler candidate could master the necessary skills. The program was working, but scaling it to meet operational demand would take time that soldiers in the field did not have. The expansion brought complications nobody had anticipated. Between September and December of 1966, the number of scout dog teams operating in the 3 Corps grew from 32 to 78. Training standards remained rigorous, but the accelerated deployment schedule meant some handlers arrived in country with less field experience than the original cohort. The dogs themselves varied in capability. A top-tier German Shepherd like Rex could detect scent signatures at 70 meters under ideal conditions. A less experienced Labrador might alert at 40 meters, or miss subtle indicators entirely. Handler skill mattered just as much as canine ability. Reading a dog's body language required hundreds of hours of observation to distinguish between a genuine alert and simple distraction. Some handlers developed this intuition quickly. Others struggled to interpret signals until it was too late. The variance created problems in units that had come to depend on dog teams as infallible detection systems. They were not infallible. They were tools that worked best when properly employed by skilled operators, and the reality of wartime expansion meant quality control was increasingly difficult to maintain. Private First Class Joseph Morales experienced this learning curve firsthand. Assigned to 3rd Battalion in August of 1966, Morales was a 19-year-old scout from Texas who had initially viewed the dog teams with skepticism bordering on contempt. Dogs were animals, not soldiers. Relying on them seemed like a failure of human capability, an admission that American training and technology could not solve problems without resorting to what amounted to circus tricks. His attitude changed on September 9th during a patrol northwest of Cu Chi. The platoon was moving through dense jungle along a trail that had been swept 3 times in the previous week. Standard visual inspection had found nothing. But Walsh and Rex were walking point that day, and 40 meters in, Rex alerted. Ears forward, nostrils sampling the humid air in rapid succession. Walsh halted the patrol and brought Davis forward to investigate. What they found was a pressure-detonated mine emplaced since the last patrol, buried shallow enough that the next soldier to step on that exact spot would have triggered 200 grams of TNT directly under his left foot. Morales had been walking second position. If Walsh and Rex had not been leading, Morales would have been the one to step on it. The realization was immediate and physical. The dog had just saved his life by detecting something he could not see, hear, or smell. The experience transformed Morales from skeptic to advocate. He began studying how the handlers worked, asking questions about scent detection ranges, environmental factors that affected performance, and the specific body language cues that indicated different types of alerts. Walsh was patient with the questions, explaining that dogs processed information on timescales faster than human perception. A scent alert happened in milliseconds, ears rotating toward the source, nostrils flaring, head position shifting to triangulate the odor's origin. By the time a handler registered the alert and signaled the platoon to stop, the dog had already completed its analysis and was waiting for direction. The handler's job was not to think faster than the dog, but to trust the alert and act on it immediately. Hesitation could mean walking past the threat, or, worse, walking into it. Captain Jackson monitored the program's expansion with a combination of pride and concern. The success metrics were undeniable. By November of 1966, scout dog teams had been credited with detecting over 800 booby traps and 140 ambush positions across the 3 corps. Casualty rates in units operating with regular dog team support had dropped 67% compared to the same unit's performance before the program began. But Jackson also recognized the risks of over-reliance. Units that became dependent on dog teams sometimes neglected basic infantry skills, visual observation, terrain analysis, patrol discipline. If a handler and dog were killed or evacuated for medical reasons, the platoon could find itself operating with reduced capability and inflated confidence. Jackson pushed for better integration, training infantry soldiers to understand what dogs could and could not do, emphasizing that scout teams were a supplement to existing tactics rather than a replacement. The message was not always well received. Soldiers who had watched dogs save their lives repeatedly were inclined to trust the animals more than any briefing officer. The Viet Cong response evolved in parallel. By late 1966, intelligence reports indicated that VC and NVA units were implementing increasingly sophisticated countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize scout dog effectiveness. Some units began using time delay mines that could be in place days before an expected patrol, allowing human scent signatures to dissipate before American forces entered the area. Others experimented with chemical irritants, concentrated ammonia or pepper compounds scattered along trails to overwhelm the dog's olfactory systems. Results were inconsistent. Dogs could often work through or around the irritants, and the chemicals themselves sometimes served as indicators that something unusual was present. The most effective countermeasure remained the simplest: avoid engagement when dog teams were present, and attack when they were not. VC commanders began tracking which American units operated with regular dog team support, and which did not, allocating ambush resources accordingly. Units without dogs became preferred targets. The unintended consequence was a widening disparity in casualty rates. Battalions with sufficient dog team coverage saw sustained reductions in booby trap and ambush casualties throughout late 1966. Battalions without coverage experienced rates similar to or higher than pre-program averages. The disparity created tension within the division. Some commanders requested permanent assignment of dog teams to their units. Others argued that dogs should be rotated to ensure equitable distribution of the capability. Jackson advocated for a middle approach: maintain a central pool of handler-dog pairs that could be allocated based on operational requirements and threat assessments. High-risk patrols in known VC-controlled areas received priority. Lower-risk operations proceeded without dedicated dog support. The system was imperfect, but necessary given the limited number of available teams. Walsh and Rex continued to operate at a tempo that concerned Jackson from a veterinary perspective. Between June and November of 1966, they conducted 93 patrols, an average of more than 3 per week. Rex was performing well, but the accumulated stress of constant scent detection work in high-threat environments was taking a toll. Dogs were not machines. They experienced fear, exhaustion, and psychological strain just as humans did. Jackson recommended that handlers rotate their dogs off patrol duty for recovery periods, 1 week of rest for every 4 weeks of active work. Some handlers complied. Others, including Walsh, resisted the guidance. Walsh trusted Rex completely and believed rotating to a different dog team would increase risk for the platoon. The logic was understandable, but unsustainable. By December, Rex was showing signs of detection fatigue, slower alert times, occasional missed indicators, reduced enthusiasm for patrol work. Jackson ordered a mandatory 2-week rest period and assigned a replacement team to cover Walsh's platoon. Walsh complied reluctantly, spending the rest period at Coochie Kennels working with Rex on basic obedience and play behaviors designed to reduce stress and rebuild the dog's confidence. The success of the Scout Dog program by year's end was reflected in the numbers that mattered most to soldiers on the ground. Across the 25th Infantry Division's area of operations, booby trap casualties declined from an average of 18 per week in January 1966 to 7 per week in December. Ambush casualties dropped from 12 per week to 5. The dogs had not eliminated the threats. Viet Cong fighters were adapting continuously and would continue to do so, but they had fundamentally changed the tactical equation. American patrols were no longer walking blind through an environment designed to kill them. They had scout teams that could detect danger before it became lethal, and that capability was saving lives in numbers that could be counted, documented, and verified through casualty reports that told a story simpler and more powerful than any briefing ever could. The collapse came without warning on February 14, 1967. Walsh and Rex were leading a patrol through the Ben Suk corridor, an area that had been relatively quiet for 3 weeks, following a major sweep operation. Intelligence suggested the Viet Cong had withdrawn deeper into the Iron Triangle, ceding ground rather than risk engagement with units supported by scout dogs. The patrol moved with the confidence that came from months of successful detection. Rex had alerted twice in the first hour, both times on old booby trap sites that had already been cleared and marked. False positives happened occasionally, usually when residual scent signatures from previous threats confused the dog's discrimination. Walsh noted the alerts in his log, but continued the patrol. Standard procedure. At 11:45 hours, Rex stopped again. The alert was different this time. Ears locked forward, body rigid, nostrils processing information with an intensity Walsh had learned to recognize as genuine threat detection. He signaled the platoon to halt and called Davis forward. The explosive specialist approached carefully, probing the area Rex had indicated with a bayonet, the standard technique for locating buried ordnance without applying enough pressure to trigger detonation. 3 meters off the trail, Davis found the first mine, a Soviet PMD-6, identical to dozens they had disarmed over the previous months. But as he began excavating around it, he discovered something unusual. The mine was part of a cluster, 3 devices buried in close proximity, each angled to create overlapping fragmentation patterns. The Viet Cong had adapted again. Instead of single mines designed to kill 1 or 2 soldiers, they were now emplacing coordinated arrays that could devastate an entire squad if triggered simultaneously. Davis called for additional support and began the careful process of disarming the array. The work required 40 minutes of precise manipulation, cutting detonator wires, removing fuses, excavating each device without disturbing the others. Walsh kept Rex at a safe distance, watching the tree line for any indication of enemy observation. The jungle was silent except for insect noise and the occasional bird call. No indication of hostile presence, but the silence itself was suspicious. Ambush sites were often quiet because local wildlife learned to avoid areas where humans congregated with violent intent. Walsh signaled the platoon lieutenant to maintain high alert. Something about the situation felt wrong in ways he could not articulate. Davis successfully disarmed all 3 mines by 12:30 hours. The platoon prepared to continue the patrol. Walsh brought Rex forward again, allowing the dog to sweep the area one more time before the unit moved out. Rex alerted immediately. Same location, same intensity. Davis returned to the site, confused. He had just cleared 3 mines from this exact spot. What else could be there? He probed deeper, moving soil carefully with his hands rather than tools. 10 centimeters below where the first mine array had been buried, he found the real trap. A 4th mine, larger than the others, rigged with a pressure release trigger. The mines Davis had just removed were decoys. The Viet Cong had anticipated that American EOD specialists would disarm them, relax their vigilance, and then trigger the actual device buried underneath. It was a trap within a trap, designed specifically to kill the people trying to save lives. The realization sent a shock through the patrol that transcended tactical analysis. The enemy was not just adapting to scout dogs, they were adapting to the entire disarmament process, creating layered deceptions that exploited American thoroughness and standard operating procedure. Davis disarmed the 4th mine with hands that shook slightly despite his experience. The psychological impact was immediate. If the Viet Cong could predict and counter American countermeasures this effectively, what other assumptions were wrong? How many other patrol routes contained traps designed not just to kill, but to kill specifically those trying to prevent killing? Walsh filed an after-action report that afternoon that Jackson read with growing concern. The nested mine configuration was not an isolated innovation. Intelligence reports from other units operating in Threed Corps described similar discoveries: booby traps designed to defeat detection and disarmament procedures, ambush sites positioned to target dog handlers specifically, even attempts to poison dogs by leaving contaminated food along known patrol routes. The Viet Cong were waging a deliberate campaign to neutralize the scout dog program by any means available. Some methods were crude. Others, like the nested mines, showed sophisticated understanding of American tactics and the specific vulnerabilities of dog-assisted operations. The strain began showing in ways both measurable and anecdotal. Handler stress rates increased as the psychological burden of walking point with a target on their backs accumulated over months of continuous patrols. Dog performance declined as the animals absorbed the tension radiating from handlers who could no longer maintain the calm consistency that effective scent detection required. Rex's alert times slowed. Jody developed a reluctance to move forward on trails where visual indicators suggested hidden threats, even when scent detection showed nothing. The dogs were not breaking. They were adapting to an environment where their handlers' fear had become a constant background signal that complicated their ability to process genuine threat information. Walsh requested a meeting with Jackson on February 20th. The conversation was brief and direct. Walsh explained that Rex was no longer performing at the level required for point duty. The dog was physically healthy, but psychologically exhausted from 8 months of sustained high-threat operations. Walsh himself was struggling with the same exhaustion. The accumulated weight of knowing that every patrol could be his last, that the enemy was specifically targeting him and Rex, that even successful detection no longer guaranteed safety when the traps were designed to kill during disarmament. Jackson listened without interruption and then made a decision he had been avoiding for months. He ordered Walsh and Rex rotated off patrol duty for 30 days of full recovery. No training, no demonstrations, no duties beyond basic care and maintenance. The recommendation was effective immediately. The pattern repeated across other handler dog pairs throughout March of 1967. Henson and Jody were rotated off after Jody suffered a minor injury from shrapnel during a mortar attack on Cu Chi. 2 other teams were evacuated for medical treatment when their dogs developed bacterial infections from prolonged exposure to contaminated water. The operational tempo had been unsustainable, and the consequences were now manifesting in reduced program effectiveness at exactly the moment when Viet Cong countermeasures were becoming more sophisticated. Jackson found himself managing a capability that was simultaneously more valuable than ever and more fragile than anyone had anticipated. The dogs were saving lives in numbers that continued to justify the program's existence. But the cost, measured in handler stress, dog health, and the constant escalation of enemy counter-tactics, was mounting in ways that raised questions about long-term viability. Casualty statistics for March 1967 showed the impact of reduced dog team availability. Units operating without regular scout dog support experienced booby trap casualties at rates 43% higher than units with dedicated teams. The disparity was stark enough that battalion commanders began competing for the limited pool of available handler dog pairs, sometimes pulling rank to secure coverage for their own operations at the expense of other units. Jackson resisted the pressure when possible, but operational necessity often overrode his concerns about sustainable deployment practices. The dogs were needed everywhere simultaneously, and there were never enough teams to meet demand. The program's success had created its own crisis, proof of concept that outpaced the ability to scale effectively while maintaining quality and protecting the well-being of handlers and animals who bore the daily burden of Walking Point in a war where the enemy had learned to fear and target them specifically. Walsh returned to patrol duty on March 22, 1967, after the mandated recovery period. Rex was rested, alert, and moving with the focused intensity that had made him one of the most reliable detection dogs in the division. But Walsh himself had changed in ways that were difficult to quantify. The 30-day break had given him perspective that continuous deployment never allowed. He understood now that the Scout Dog program was not a permanent solution, but a tactical adaptation in an ongoing competition between opposing forces who learned from each other continuously. The Viet Cong would keep adapting. New trap designs would appear. New countermeasures would emerge. The dogs would detect some and miss others, and the cycle would continue until the war ended or the enemy found a way to neutralize the capability entirely. The realization was neither optimistic nor pessimistic. It was simply accurate, a recognition that survival in Vietnam required accepting uncertainty and operating effectively despite it. The patrol on March 22nd covered familiar ground south of Cu Chi along a trail network that had been swept weekly since January. Rex alerted twice in the first hour, both times on fresh booby trap emplacements that Davis disarmed without incident. The Viet Cong were still there, still placing traps, still trying to kill American soldiers through concealment and misdirection. But they were no longer achieving the casualty rates they had managed before the dogs arrived. The tactical environment had shifted permanently. VC commanders understood that ambushes in areas with regular dog team presence carried unacceptable risk of premature detection. Intelligence reports from captured documents confirmed what the casualty statistics already suggested. Viet Cong units were reallocating resources away from zones where scout dogs operated frequently and concentrating their efforts in areas where American patrols remained vulnerable. The dogs had not eliminated the threat. They had displaced it, forcing the enemy to fight where detection capabilities were weakest and avoiding engagement where they were strongest. By mid-1967, the Scout Dog program had expanded to over 150 handler dog teams operating across all 4 core tactical zones in South Vietnam. The success in the 3rd Corps had convinced commanders in other regions that the capability was worth the logistical burden of maintaining specialized kennels, veterinary facilities, and training programs. Dogs were being used not just for patrol work, but for tunnel detection, perimeter security, and prisoner guarding. The mission set had grown far beyond the original conception of simple scent detection for booby traps and ambushes. Some handlers welcomed the expansion as recognition of their value. Others worried that spreading the program across too many mission types would dilute effectiveness and increase the risk of misuse by commanders who did not understand the dog's limitations. Jackson, promoted to major in April of 1967, spent increasing amounts of time managing program expansion rather than operational employment. The administrative burden was significant. Each dog required approximately 40 pounds of food per week, specialized veterinary care, climate-controlled kennel space, and regular rotation out of high-stress duties. Handlers needed ongoing training to maintain proficiency and mental health support to manage the psychological strain of being priority targets. The logistics of sustaining 150 teams across a combat theater the size of South Vietnam challenged supply chains that were already stressed supporting conventional infantry operations. Jackson fought continuously for resources, arguing that the casualty reduction numbers justified any expenditure. The statistics supported his case. By June of 1967, Scout Dog teams had been credited with detecting over 4,000 booby traps and ambush positions since the program's inception. Conservative estimates suggested they had prevented at least 10,000 American casualties, deaths and serious injuries that would have occurred without early warning. The human cost of the program was documented in different ways. 37 handlers had been killed in action by mid-1967, primarily through sniper fire or command-detonated mines triggered specifically to target dog teams. 62 dogs had been killed, wounded, or retired due to medical conditions ranging from heat stroke to bacterial infections to psychological trauma that rendered them unable to perform detection work. The casualty rate among handlers was higher than the infantry average, a function of walking point continuously rather than rotating positions within the patrol. Some handlers accepted the risk as inherent to the mission. Others requested transfer after experiencing near misses or watching other teams killed in front of them. Jackson did not deny transfer requests. He understood that effectiveness required willing volunteers who believed in the work, and forcing handlers to continue after their confidence was shattered served no tactical purpose. Walsh and Rex completed their tour in October of 1967. Over 17 months in Vietnam, they had conducted 147 patrols and detected 91 booby traps and 23 ambush positions. 0 casualties in any patrol they led. Walsh was recommended for a Bronze Star for his service, though the award was delayed by administrative processing that took months to complete. Rex was retired from active duty and offered to Walsh for adoption through a military working dog program that allowed handlers to keep their dogs rather than euthanizing them at the end of their service, a policy change that Jackson and other advocates had fought for over the objections of officials who viewed the dogs as equipment rather than partners. Walsh accepted immediately. They flew back to Iowa together in November, Rex sedated for the flight, but otherwise healthy. Walsh carrying paperwork that documented their shared history in numbers and dates that could not capture what the experience had actually been. The legacy of the Scout Dog program extended far beyond individual handler dog pairs. By the end of American ground combat operations in Vietnam, approximately 4,000 military working dogs had served in country, and their handlers were credited with saving more than 10,000 American lives through early detection of threats that would have otherwise killed or maimed soldiers walking patrols through an environment designed to kill them. The dogs did not win the war. No single tactical innovation could have accomplished that in a conflict shaped by political constraints, strategic confusion, and an enemy willing to absorb casualties at rates that shocked American commanders accustomed to conventional warfare. But the dogs gave individual soldiers a tool that worked in the jungle's favor rather than against it, and for the men who walked behind them day after day, that was enough. The Viet Cong never found a permanent solution to the Scout Dog problem. They adapted continuously, developing new trap designs and ambush techniques that sometimes succeeded in defeating detection. But the fundamental challenge remained unchanged. Dogs could smell threats that humans could not see, and no amount of tactical innovation could eliminate scent signatures entirely. VC commanders eventually accepted that operations in areas with regular dog team presence carried unacceptable risk and adjusted their strategy accordingly, avoiding engagement where American detection capabilities were strongest and concentrating force where they remained vulnerable. The adaptation was itself a form of success for the Scout Dog program, forcing the enemy to change behavior in ways that reduced American casualties, even when dogs were not physically present. Walsh spent the next 30 years training military working dogs at facilities across the United States, passing on the intuitive understanding of canine behavior he had developed in Vietnam to handlers who would deploy to conflicts he could not have imagined. Rex lived with him until 1982, dying peacefully at age 18 in the same farmhouse where Walsh had grown up, learning that trust between humans and animals was earned through consistency and proven through survival. The lesson held true across contexts. The dogs saved lives because their handlers trusted them completely, and that trust was built on hundreds of hours of working together in conditions where mistakes were lethal and success was measured in the simplest possible terms. Everyone came home,